Hello everybody, welcome back to Reaper Minis TV. Don't have a Rezig army update for you yet, just started on them last episode, but we do have some more reviews to get to. Starting off with a whole bunch of Warlord reviews this episode, and this first one is another new Dark Elf, or from the Dark Reach faction from Savage North. It's a single piece miniature, I'll try not to butcher his name. It's Erdolliel Saerwen. Or maybe something like that. Maybe that's close. But he's carrying a bunch of large throwing stars, really big throwing stars. And you can see there's one in his right hand, he's rearing back, ready to throw. There's another in his left hand. There's one on his belt, and probably some more hidden under his cloak and stuff that we can't see. His armor is pretty much the same as the other Dark Reach elves that we've seen in the past several episodes. So bits and pieces of plate armor, and it just looks very segmented, and just I think it's very stylish. I like the look of it a lot. He has the same kind of tattered cloak that the others do, and face is very slender. His hair is spiked up, almost like he's got gel in his hair, but I don't know what the fantasy equivalent of that would be. Probably some kind of animal fat or something that he uses to spike his hair up, or some underground gel from a phosphorescent plant or something like that. Anyway, good single piece miniature here. It did need some cleaning, but since it's an addition to the Dark Reach Dark Elves, which means it's also a potential addition to my Dark Elf army for Warhammer Fantasy, I'm already a fan. Okay, now we get into the first of three new dwarves for the Kragmarr faction, also from Savage North. This first guy is a Kragmarr guard. It's a single-piece dwarf miniature. He's wearing plate armor along with a metal helmet. He's carrying a spear in two hands, and also has a fairly large shield strapped to his back. He's in a very at-the-ready pose, or almost a defensive pose, where he's waiting for somebody to charge in. And like a pretty stereotypical dwarf, pretty full beard and mustache, but you can see his full face under the helmet. And the most significant mold line was running across the top of the helmet, but there was also a bit of metal that ran down from the end of the spear down to the casting tab that you'll need to clip off and clean up a little bit. If you weren't going to use him for a Kragmarr army in Warlord, I think he'd make a fine player character for any kind of role-playing game, or you could also get a whole bunch of these together and make a very nice unit of Dwarven Spearmen for a tabletop game like Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Our next Kragmarr dwarf is a Rune warrior. This is a two-piece model. His right hand and axe come as a separate piece, but the rest of the model is all on its own, and you can see he's carrying a large round wooden shield. It has some nice details on the front of it. It's a dwarven head on the front of it. He's carrying a horn on his belt along with a couple of pouches, wearing some plate armor and some chain along with some furs, so pretty heavily armored. And you can see he's also wearing a horned helm. He's got a very almost vicious or angry, almost like you might think of a troll slayer or a giant slayer in Warhammer, just a very crazed look on his face. And he's in very much of an action-oriented combat kind of pose where he's rearing back about to strike somebody, but also leaving himself pretty wide open to a retaliatory strike. If he didn't have as much armor on, I might be able to pass him off as a troll slayer or giant slayer in Warhammer, but I really don't think he fits that role too well. But using him as a Dwarven Barbarian or Dwarven Berserker in a role-playing game, I think he'd be perfect. And our last Kragmarr dwarf for this episode is Konrad Graniteheart, and he is a Kragmarr Guard Sergeant. So he's a leader of the previous Kragmarr Guard, the guy with the two-handed spear that we saw earlier. He's also carrying a long spear, but it's just in his left hand, and you can see there's some ribbons on the top of it. And he's in very much of a pose where he's sort of looking back, yelling at his comrades, and maybe urging them forward into the fight itself. So I like the pose a lot. It has a lot of animation to it. There's a little bit of a story maybe behind it. So that right there makes it stand out a little more than just a guy with a spear who we're saying is a sergeant. He's wearing the same kind of armor and has a shield strapped to his back, just like the other Kragmarr warrior that we saw, and his spear has a little extra bit of metal that's at the very bottom from the casting process that you'll need to clip off. There were a little bit more of visible mold lines on him than on the previous guy with the spear that we saw, but nothing that took too long to clean up, and I think a unit of these would look very nice all ranked up together. Even though Warlord is more of a skirmish game, I just think the visual of a bunch of the dwarves with two-handed spears and him leading them on would look pretty cool. Okay, now we have a large miniature on a 40mm base from the Coalshadow line, or the Coalshadow faction, I should say, and I'll try to get it out of the package without gouging myself with the X-Acto blade here, and might be successful. Here we go. And you can see we got a full color picture on the front just to give you maybe a little bit of guidance on painting the miniature. And then inside we have a base and then two pieces that make up this large figure. So here's the figure itself and her spear. Spear was a little bit bent in the package, but it goes together pretty easily. There's just a socket and void joint on the miniature where it goes together up on her shoulder. And on the spear itself, you can see it needs some cleaning. There's some extra flashing from the casting process and a little bit of a thin web on the blade itself, but nothing too bad that will be too hard for you to clean up. There's nice detailing of the fur on the model. She is wearing some extra bits of adventuring gear. There's some pouches and what look like scroll cases on her belt. The face just to me looks a little bit more fox-like than wolf-like, but I could be way off on that. But a nice miniature that would be good for a spellcaster if you had a need for that that's outside of the Warlord game. But overall, a good figure that looks like it'll go together quickly and be pretty striking on the tabletop once you get it painted. Okay, and our last Warlord figure for this episode is Torg, an Orc Tundra Stalker Sergeant, and he is from the Kragmarr faction in Savage North. And this is a single-piece miniature of a very large orc, easily passable for a black orc in a Warhammer army, or maybe mixed with some of the other black orcs that Reaper has put out. He's carrying two very heavy swords, or choppas if you're playing Warhammer, a mix of a couple different kinds of armor. There's some plate there, there's what looks like to be some studded leather armor, some fur, along with a pouch and some kind of little trophy that's hanging off his belt. Now, he did need a little more cleaning than some of the other models we've looked at. There was a bit of metal from one of the swords, the one in his left hand, down to his boot that needed to be cleaned off, and two other small tabs from the casting process that went from the tab itself back to the backside of his large cloak. So a little bit more cleaning involved with him, but like I said, very cool black orc type figure that I would easily drop into a big unit of orcs that I'm putting together for a Warhammer Fantasy roleplay encounter eventually. But you could very easily use him in any kind of role-playing game as an orc, maybe sergeant or main boss kind of orc, or even as a player character if you allow monster races in your fantasy role-playing game. Okay, and on to a few Dark Heaven Legends figures now. This first one is a thief. His name is Collin Coalshadow, and he's sort of sculpted in more of a, in my mind anyway, a diorama kind of pose, to where you can see he's got a long length of rope that he is climbing down, or maybe he's climbing up. It's coiled at the bottom underneath his right foot, and he's got a ton of gear on. There's a large backpack with a bedroll and a pick and a sword at his side. And while all the detailing is really good on the model, the hair is done well. On his scabbard there's a lot of little small intricate detailing. The rivets on his studded leather armor all look good. It's just the pose that he's in, or maybe the sculpture itself, that I just don't know if it really fits for me as a player character model, where he's coming down the rope and all. Maybe as a thief that's exactly what he would be doing, and for you maybe that'd be perfect, but for me, the only thing that is a little bit of a turnoff for me is the pose that he's in. Otherwise, it's a very nicely sculpted miniature, but just not so much great for me. And the last figure for this episode is a large exotic idol. It comes in two large pieces that fit together, and while there is a little bit of a visible seam between the front and the back piece, I think you can take care of that with a little bit of putty pretty easily. Now on the left side of the model, it looks like down where the foot is and part of the left hand where it might be a casting error, or you got a bad casting on the figure, also up on the left horns. But when you look at the actual photograph of the model from the Reaper website, which you can see here obviously, it's exactly the same as what's in the video. So it's sculpted that way. It's meant to look that way, like it's been weathered down or worn down over the years. Now it is a pretty scary looking idol or statue where he's got a great big mouth and 3 eyes and horns up on his head, and then a whole nother big giant mouth with a tongue sticking out down in his belly. So a pretty fearsome looking statue that I think would look good in any kind of dungeon scene, either as a trap or as the treasure, or as neither one of those. You just drop this on the table and your players kind of freak out staying away from it because they don't know what it is, and then it turns out to be something or turns out to be nothing. So it's a pretty cool piece of dungeon decor. Alright everybody, thanks for watching this episode of Reaper Minis TV. We'll see you next time.